So I wish I had the proper education to be able to speak to you in Portuguese, but indeed, as Professor Ferraz mentioned, I don't have this vital capability, and it's really one that I regret. So the lecture will be in English, and it is the subtitle that hints you at what I will talk about, namely the phenomenon of agile stability. And that goes back to the classic demand and classic debate in public administration and management scholarship and practice that one of the two ways of how you can look at administrative systems is whether they look for stability, regularity, norm, something that has been the idea of classic administration to consecutively and consistently provide public services to everybody in an equal and equitable way. And on the other hand, what is the much more fashionable topic, the agility, that means nimbleness, focusedness on change, possibilities on small innovations, getting in line with technology and the future. And what of the two would be the best is something that people have been looking at in the last decade, including myself and some of my students, and particularly here, in our case, in the context of innovation policy. That means asking which kind of administrative setup would be optimal for innovation policy. That means what kind of civil servants support an innovation-based economy the best. Do they need to be agile, or do they need to be stable? And it's the agility that you would think. And this has resulted in a project with my first PhD, the gentleman on left, and his first PhD, my first grandson, the gentleman in the middle, Professor Cutler and Professor Caro, in a book for Yale University Press called Innovation Bureaucracies, Let's Make the State Entrepreneurial. You may know that the concept of the entrepreneurial state is the famous concept of Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's our boss at that London Institute. So she will actually write the preface for this book. And her new book I just saw today is now out on mission-based policies in the European Union. You know that this is probably the main foundation of EU policies for the next decade. So what we argue, and what is not only what we argue, the terminology is of course ours, but what is a bit of a trend is to say that the public sector doesn't only need to provide stability, and it doesn't only need to provide agility, but it needs to provide both, and it needs to provide both at the same time. So what we are having here is to say that optimal public sectors and optimal civil services manage to provide both the stable, the equitable, the reliable, the regular, and the agile, the nimble, the innovative. That is a big bill. This is very tough, you know? I mean, it's big enough to say be stable. It's big enough to say be agile. And now you say, okay, you have to be both. This is a huge demand for the civil service. But, well, the demands for top civil service are high. The success ladder is high, but if you have a good one, if people like you are really good, this is an absolute key criterion for the success of a country or a region. And it's not surprising that the demand for top-level service is particularly high, and that one really needs to work on how to get there. So what I can say already as something that softens the problem is that it seems that it is actually not absolutely necessary to have agility and stability in every single institution. But the question is one of a public sector ecosystem. That means that various institutions interact with each other in the ecosystem, perhaps in the same office, in the same ministry, in the same government, which provide the various elements. That means those that might be more innovative and those that may be more consistent rollout focus, if you will. But it needs to be there in successful systems. And this is less a remark from theory that it should be so, but it's an empirical remark from studying successful governments, both in history, in the last hundreds of years of modern government, and today, as far as the challenges of our time are concerned. Now, for those of you who have dealt with the history of industrial policy, of state policy and administration, you will very quickly associate the concept of innovation and entrepreneurship, including in the public sector, with the Austrian-American theorist Joseph Alois Schumpeter, whom you see depicted here. Schumpeter actually coined the term of innovation in our time, and the more stable, regular, classic, if you will, administration you associated with Max Weber. So in a way, this discourse sometimes has been framed as being one between Weberian administration and Schumpeterian administration. Let me do a small footnote here, because we are in a public administration context. After all, Weber died 100 years plus a few months ago. That means in the middle of 1920. So over 100 years ago exactly. So we had various celebrations last year and conferences and new books, but not that many because of COVID, of course. Most were canceled or put online. And the irony here is that Weber died from post-effects of the last pandemic. Weber was one of the last victims of the Spanish flu, which was the last time that Europe was suffering from a very, very similar virus as far as the rollout is concerned than the last time, and that immediately connects us with him. And that has brought Weber again to the forefront of public administration and management knowledge. Now, Weber is, for us in public management, mostly known as a scholar of classic administration, which is indeed named after him. He didn't like it, but it's named after him anyway. But he was actually an economist, and he was a professor of economics, not of PA. By training, he was a lawyer, and by profession, he was an economist. And his economic work, although very important, especially as far as Asia is concerned, is more neglected. But what is important here for us is that indeed what Schumpeter says about agile bureaucracy, Weber himself says as well. So actually we can say there are two kinds of Weberianisms here, and we call that even Weber 1 and Weber 2. That means Weber himself, the father of classical bureaucracy, already recognizes not only that we need agility and stability at the same time, but also that the emphasis of either follows a certain pattern, not a necessarily predictable pattern, but there are times when the state has to provide in general more stability because there is a business sector that is extremely agile and pushing and so on, and then the state needs to jump in and provide stability. And then there are times where leadership doesn't come from the private sector, when the state needs to be the innovator, not of the last resorts, but of choice, and when both need to be the case. Now, you could say, oh, for an executive perspective, why do we care what a 100-year dead German theoretician said about that? But what is important here is that it is already the same person, and one of the real key persons, one of the 5 greatest public administration thinkers of all times, no question, who looks at this already in parallel. That means you recognize functions that you should not separate and opt for one or the other, but that overall, if I look at the role of the public sector in society and societal development, I want to integrate. And by the way, this is not only the case for the public sector, this is the case for the private sector as well. Weber was very strong in emphasizing that large corporations have a tendency to bureaucratize just as well and follow bureaucratic logics, not only state-owned enterprises, but also the big enterprises of our time. They don't emphasize that because it's not cool, and they give themselves this kind of start-uppy, networky, charismatic air. But in reality, look at your smartphone, and all of you will have a smartphone right now. And I can almost promise you that this smartphone was produced by a bureaucracy. All the great smartphone factories that we have, all the manufacturers that we have, are large-scale classical bureaucracy. Foxconn here, they are making the stuff for Apple. So if you have an iPhone, you have a Foxconn. This is a Taiwanese firm that has production mostly in Taiwan. But Samsung is a bureaucracy. Huawei is more bureaucratic than the Prussian state was. Completely hierarchical, top down, and so on and so on. Xiaomi is the same, and so on and so on. So Weber knew that, and he was very, very clear on that. And so he was very clear on the contextual dimension. He was very clear on the evolutionary and cyclical dimension of what he was talking about here. It does concern the public sector the most, and this is our attention, but the private just as well. Now, this is all the more important if we look at the fact, surprising to many, if you listen to the media, that we are not in a time of shrinking public sectors, and I don't mean only the size, but actually the tasks. In other words, in 2021, we are in a time when state activities, state policies, state innovation, and state-led change are more important than for many times before. We are not in a time of the quiet state. Again, I come back to mission-based innovation policy as the #1 priority of development in the European Union. I come back to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. You know what you get for a policy? Almost nothing. If government decides a policy, that's it. Nothing happens. It needs to be implemented, and it needs to be implemented in context. Who is doing this? That is done by the public administration, and that is why public administration is inevitable, and why the alternative to a badly working bureaucratic, in the negative sense, public administration is not less bureaucracy, but better bureaucracy. And if now in the pandemic we are all saying we need to build back better, who is this we? Who are the people who are actually doing this? If we are looking at the great challenges, such as the ecological challenge, right? Carbon reduction, the refocus on smart green growth, or if we think that smart green growth isn't good enough, on even degrowth. Never mind what all of these Davos topics are. Who is actually going to implement it? All these are classical state tasks that need to be implemented by civil services on the various levels of nation, region, UN, EU, and so on, that are tasked with these tasks. And that means that they need to be good. In fact, they need to be excellent, and they need to be fully aware of what tasks at any given point are. The slide here, Bhutan, you might have heard about the gross national happiness, is the only carbon negative country in the world. There is 2 points why I have the slide. The first is Bhutan is incredibly bureaucracy-led. 70% of all firms are state-owned enterprises, and the green nature of Bhutan is entirely bureaucracy-driven. Well, bureaucracy and monarchy-driven, of course, but they belong together. And the second is, if this is the only carbon negative country in the world and we all want to go there, it means it's a huge global effort that we are faced with. And it is a public effort and not one that is only grassroots. So that shows us how important it is for our times. This actually is the one nod I want to make, as Professor Ferraz mentioned, to Portugal here. Because for me, the figure here of the Marrakech de Pombal, who is one of the great heroes of, if you will, authoritarian enlightenism, that means of a top-down but liberal reform into the future, and never mind the politics, the successes are absolutely amazing. We are, in a sense, through COVID-19 in a Pombalista global environment. That means the earthquake has happened and now we need to build back better. And we need to do that partially, at least, not exclusively, but partially with public sector-led means, just as under Pombal. Somebody needs to map out these streets. Somebody needs to build the buildings. Somebody needs to classify the agriculture, and so on and so on. So this is something where from history and even in a built environment in Lisbon, as you know, you can learn from. That means not, of course, the details and how to do it. It's a long time ago, but the principle of state-led building back better is a truly Portuguese experience, I think. And in fact, we can even go a little bit further here and say that, once again, those countries that have been able to deal with a pandemic in a particularly good way tended to be those who had classic large, high capacity civil services and at the same time were able, for instance, as far as tracing apps is concerned, to be very nimble and agile at the same time. So where you had e-governance crack teams, small ones, but also a large and very reputable bureaucracy in whose framework you could go on in this way. Now, of course, I need to make a footnote here. During COVID, everybody has their own theories and says, look, COVID is proving my point. And we are getting too many essays, also in public administration, of how the reactions actually were. And it's kind of funny as we see, and we see it in Portugal and in Germany, exactly once you have written your essay about why your country coped particularly well in COVID, COVID does something new, and what you've said before is worthless. So this is work in progress, but I think it is fair to say that agile stability is a feature of bureaucracy of those countries that have coped with COVID the best. Now, this is a small outline of what this agile stability means. What is the problem if you have only one or only the other? What would be so wrong in having an only agile or an only stable bureaucracy? And for this, I would suggest we look at administrative systems, recent systems that we all know, and that have actually done that. That means that have been overly agile and overly stable. And overly stable, classic, boring, top-down bureaucracies, we all know. This is what everybody complains about. That's not the question. But what is actually the recent public management system that was overly agile? Well, that was the new public management. The entire idea of the new public management, which was going away from the classic Weberian stable system into a project-oriented, short-term, finance-led, incentive-led system in which you hack the system according to private business practices. And the problem here is that, especially if you look at the pandemic, you attract the wrong people, you incentivize the wrong people. The state can never in salaries and incentives compete with the private sector. So there needs to be something else, such as commitment and such as long-term orientation. And of course, this is what we see during the pandemic. Civil servants who try to realize what they are doing with a bit of a wider scope and with less goal agreements, with less performance contracts, have done better because nobody has written anyone a pandemic into their performance contracts. If this was all you needed to do, you were useless in the last year. Yeah. It is not less rent seeking. Of course, we had it in the stable systems, but we have it in the NPM systems as well. That means that people just tried to satisfy what there was. And this is why really the reform program of MPM, which is also for other reasons such a failure in its attempt to be only agile, died as well. Now, I've mentioned already the classic bureaucracy is just not something that is very attractive. You all know that. There are countries in this world, European countries, where being part of the bureaucracy is as such and per se attractive and prestigious. In most European states, that's not the case, and it's not getting better. In the Confucian countries of East Asia, it is actually very prestigious to join the civil service because the country and their systems are civil service driven. But we should, when we talk about the horrors of the new public management, also not forget that indeed imperial civil services of the old dusty type did have a lot of drawbacks. They did go into entrenched rent seeking of members who didn't want to work and just draw their rents. They were self-referential and completely process-oriented and so on and so on. The thing is only that such systems we don't have so much even anymore. And today, since our culture, our entrepreneurial and startup-oriented culture emphasizes agility, it is the stability that needs help. So that if I talk about agile stability, I don't need to convince people that bureaucracy needs to be agile, but I need to convince them that they are stable as well. It's not the other way around. And that is why some emphasis here is necessary. But the stable elements of a well-balanced civil service do not need to be killed by agile measures. Not everybody need or should turn agile. And this is why I would say that if we are looking at iLabs and other accelerators in the government, if they do not transform the entire organization, this is not a failure, it's actually the point. And this is why this theory answers some of the biggest concerns of current public management, which we're looking at these islands of innovation in the public sector and saying, yeah, but they basically didn't work. The famous Mind Lab in Denmark or Nesta in the United States, in the United Kingdom, of course, they didn't manage to transform the sitting civil service. And so some people say, well, they failed. No, they didn't fail. They added the agile element, but they were never supposed, systematically speaking, to transform the entire public sector. And if they didn't, that is therefore not a loss. So, how? We are in a program for civil servants here. How do you get the best people who can manage either being agile or stable or both, or if they are just agile or stable, can tolerate that other possibilities exist? How do we get them into the civil service? And that is exactly one of the big questions of our times. Yeah? One of Weber's best books on bureaucracy is about the Imperial Chinese civil service, the oldest, the basis actually of modern civil service. Francis Fukuyama said the modern state arose in China. Everything in public management happened in China about 1,000 years before it did in the West. Performance contracts, for instance, are a Chinese institution of about 1,000 years ago. So they have done absolutely everything, not absolutely everything, but they have done almost everything before the West. And of course, China is coming back as a bureaucracy-led country. Plus, we need to recognize that the Confucian systems of PA are not only in China, but also in the other Confucian countries, the original ones being Vietnam and South Korea, Korea as such, but what is today South Korea, but also, for instance, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, but also historically Japan are Confucian countries that have this kind of system. And the question of the classic East Asian system was not, how can I reduce the public sector, but how can I get the best and truly best performing people into the civil service? And here, perhaps the focus on the creative part, on the meeting of the social challenges, and of the possibility to be both, according to where you are as far as projects and as far as your life is concerned. Agile and stable is important, that there is true expertise and true learning. What is key, however, I think we see that globally, is that it is important for the top leadership of a given country or supranational institution to recognize the importance of the civil service and prioritize both the civil service and the right incentive system, as well as the recruitment. So countries decline in administrative capabilities and capacities always then if political leadership doesn't recognize how important the civil service is, or worse, touts the populist agenda of blaming the bureaucrats for the politicians' faults. That is a classic. If politicians fail, they blame the bureaucrats. And if this becomes a system and not only a one-off system, not only a one-off call, then what you get is that good people simply don't want to join the civil service anymore. And that means the civil service suffers. So it needs to be a positive top-level priority, right? I mean, we are now saying, how do you get the best people into the civil service? And another one in our field is an odd one. So what does this have to do with the civil service? Well, what this slide is supposed to show is that what is important in civil service is to resist fashion. Our field is more fashion-driven than you think. A lot of PA reform, a lot of public management reform is not based on need or on the considerations that we had before, but just that some minister meets a colleague at an international conference and he wants to look cool as well. That means we are running after certain fashion trends without truly and independently analyzing of what is really needed. And this has been covered by public management scholarship since many decades, that our field is one that you think is one of the most boring standard ones, and yet it is incredibly fashion driven. There is a new, as we say in Germany, a new pig driven through the village every 5 years of how we should reform, whereas we pretty much know of how to look at the tasks at hand and how to fulfill them. The aforementioned Weber version in classic China, the song Chancellor Wang Angshe, that is the gentleman here in the middle with these big Mandarin signs. By the way, this is the perfect COVID-19 head, because if you wear this hat, you're always doing the exact 1.5 meter distancing automatically. But anyway, what he, in his essay on public management reform, wrote is that let good civil servants go. Don't check them too often, not every half year, not every year. The crooks can trick you on the short term, and the good people will not be able to try their big projects. Do not evaluate civil servants more often than every 3 years. It sounds really modern, doesn't it? And it's from 1036, I believe, is this book. So this is a really interesting insight. That means what the most cited European public management scholar, Geert Boeckert, has always emphasized this. Good public administration is also premised on trust of the bureaucrats towards the people and of the people towards the bureaucrats. This is, again, a high goal, but it is something that we need for a good ecosystem. And finally, it really is the appreciation of the civil servants that is clear and that attracts the best people in. You know, New Zealand was the most managerial, most NPM-oriented country a few decades ago. It was a complete failure and they turned around. In the summer of 2019, we had one of the big public management conferences in Wellington. It's called IRSPM. And this was the opening panel on public management tools, the last of the big conferences that actually happened. After that, everything ended, you know, this was the last of the season, and we have since then just Zoomed. And the gentleman who's sitting at the absolute right here is the New Zealand State Services Commissioner. This perhaps compares to the Minister of PA, so really the one in charge of the civil service in New Zealand. And at this panel, you see me sitting there as well, he told the very interesting story of saying that, or not story, but he said, whenever I meet a civil servant, I go to her and I shake her hand and I say, thank you. Because good civil servants really bring themselves into the field, and it needs the appreciation of the whole. And how I like to put it, what we need is a civil service in which civil servants are thanked for their job, but in which there is also a reason to thank them, because they are so engaged and so competent that they really do such a good job that that thank you is appropriate. So, in a classical time, or a few decades ago, if certain things wouldn't have happened, I could now say thank you very much and we could start the question. However, I have one more point for you. And that is that we are facing, other than the pandemic and other than the ecological challenge, in our field, as well as in every field, the challenge through digitality of e-governance, digital governments, and maybe algorithmic governance, big data, and so on and so on. Whatever we are talking about in the public sector, are we still talking about bureaucracies as we did that recently? Aren't algorithms taking over our task? Will not the need for the civil service expire, or at least won't those elements that are more routine and more stable been taken over by algorithms, so that we still need only the stability? And this is a really interesting topic. But as a matter of fact, what we assumed, and I remember actually discussions a decade ago in Lisbon at the Portuguese Civil Servant Day about that. How much will, all right, let me put it like this. With digitization, we mean that documents become digital. With digitalization, we mean that processes go digital. And with digital transformation, we mean that the organizations themselves transform and change the way they do according to digitality. Digitalization happened. Digitization as well. But what we were assuming a decade or two ago, that the civil service would change organizationally according to digitality, did not happen. In fact, if you look at organigrams of ministries, and I guess it's the same in Portugal, or municipalities, or international organizations, today, 10 years ago and 20 years ago, they look the exact same. There was no digital transformation of the organization. Of the processes, yes. Of the organization, not. Why is that? This is an interesting topic, but we can also flip it around and say it was, in fact, those countries with particular high capacity, well-motivated civil servants that did the best job as far as digitalization is concerned. That means those countries that are the leading countries in digitalization today are not the ones who did new public management, not the ones who only emphasized outsourcing, or even who emphasized agile small units such as iLabs, but who had a large, stable system that sympathetically accompanied the rollout of digitality. If, again, we are coming to the concrete cases, the aforementioned New Zealand, Finland is the leading country in Europe as far as digitality is concerned. Singapore is the leading global country as far as digitality is concerned. My own residence country of Estonia is a classic example as well. It's actually partially the best known, although Finland is actually a notch better. all of these had large, high-capacity bureaucracies that took on digitalization as a mission of their own. Now, let me say, not all big bureaucracies have done digitalization well, and not all digital countries have had that. That's never the case in our field, that you have a 100% fit. But what you do have is a tendency. However, if we are continuing in the E road, that may be so today, with bureaucracy still there. But remember when I talked about artificial intelligence? How about if artificial intelligence would replace bureaucracy? But this is already the point. You know, most of what is now called artificial intelligence is not artificial intelligence, but just big data. That means it is an assembly of patterns from which you deduct something, and there is still somebody behind the keyboard following up from that of how you do it. A true sentient, that means self-reflective AI, is much higher. But if I read all the reports today about how artificial intelligence is taking over bureaucracy, there was an interesting happening in a very unlikely place recently. And this is the House of Lords. Not a place where you would think particularly top on the level of innovation and digitality, but it's a very, very intelligent place right now. There are actually no purely inherited lords left. It's a parliament of experts and of distinguished statesmen, businessmen, and so on, and women who now come together. But anyway, we had, so you get extremely intelligent, extremely sophisticated discussions in the House of Lords. I have once a year a conference on public finance and accounting in the House of Lords, and it's probably the highest level political scientific debate that I know. It's really, really excellent because it's very substance oriented, partially because it is a bit removed from politics. But anyway, politics there happen as well. We saw that during Brexit, it was very important to get things through the House of Lords in one way or the other. And the chief whip of the government party, Lord Ashton of Hyde, who was giving a speech about artificial intelligence, he was asked by a colleague, what is actually an algorithm? And normally, if you ask a politician what is an algorithm, that is pretty tough because it's difficult. But Lord Ashton was able to answer this. And he said, an algorithm is a set of rules that precisely defines a sequence of operations. This is a brilliant thing. I mean, all the IT people who've read that said, yeah, well, okay, you could say it otherwise, but yes, it's correct. And again, for an old finance guy, an old politician, a lord, this is a very good answer, spontaneous and without Googling, goes my hat off. But if you look at this definition, AI, algorithmic government, so defined, may possibly reduce bureaucrats, but it cannot replace bureaucracy because it is a form of bureaucracy in itself, because it reads as that. So if we are having a world in which humans still matter, and in which at least a few humans give the final orders, then the implementational character, yes, of a reduced civil service, or even of a replaced civil service, will still be bureaucratic. This is bad for those of our jobs who have one, but the logic of bureaucratic governance and of agile stability is not reducing. Okay, if we are envisioning a world in which machines drive the business and humans are just biomass and have nothing today, to say, then all our values are obsolete. All our principles are obsolete. Our ideas about privacy and development and so on. This is all gone. And what we have been talking about so far are all not important anymore. So if we are having such a radical change of the globe, then things look really different. And I have nothing to say about such a world. The function of bureaucracy in a world run by machines is outside of my competence. But as long as this is not the case, what we have been discussed is not stopped, but rather emphasized in an age dominated by ICT. The famous fresco by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the City Hall of Siena from the 1330s describes the good life in a good state. People are dancing in the streets, the shops are full, education is happening, a girl is writing to her wedding, the houses are in shape, new ones are being constructed, and life is generally happy. This is the goal of life that we have. It's a specifically European one, but many, many people agree with this. And it's certainly something that in the general discourse of politics also in Portugal, you would say, okay, this is a goal that we have. This is a picture which doesn't show bureaucrats, but it implies them, because what you see is a result of implemented rules that further good human living together. In order to do that, then I need really good people in the civil service, motivated, competent, modest, who can further this kind of life. It's really important to have them in times of challenging and rebuilding dynamics more than ever. And that is why it's so important to have programs like the ones you have, like the reflections that you have, the always self-questioning of whether we are really doing it, and trying to balance the different dynamics to secure a decent outcome for everyone.